This will be Stephen Mitchell's transliteration, Tao Te Ching, Chapter 2. It reads, "When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has but doesn't possess, acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever." Whoa. Before we get into the line-by-line breakdown, I think it's quite apparent that there's an obvious link between what's being said here and the concept of Tai Chi, right? At the very least, the concept of Tai Chi is about complementary pairs, opposites. But the word opposite is the root word of opposition. And that's the one thing that isn't happening within the Tai Chi principle. Within the Tai Chi principle, arguably, it's the opposite of opposition, it's harmony. Though I suppose we could say that the entire work of the practice is of sort of identifying these so-called opposites within ourselves and within our interactions with other people and the world around us, and learning to harmonize them, learning to see them not as in opposition to each other, but in this sort of complementary relationship to each other. And that is a harder thing for most of us to wrap our minds around than I think it would seem to be. Right? Because just to your common sense, immediately you go, okay, I can imagine all kinds of opposites. High and low, front and back, male and female, light and dark, full and empty, etc., etc. The catch, however, is that you think of them as opposites. You think of them as separate things that couldn't be more separate than they are, right? This is this and that is that. And that kind of leads us a little bit back to what we talked about in chapter 1 about the name that can be named is not the true name, right? In other words, you give something a description, you define it, you categorize it, and in that act, separate it from everything else. That's just an illusion. It's false. It's just not a complete understanding. In this sense, for example, biologists, when trying to categorize life forms, ultimately have found that they have to include the environment of the life form. So you have not organism and environment, but something more like organism-environment. Right? That there is no way of understanding the organism outside of the environment. Its life and even perhaps its biology is so inextricably connected to and perhaps evolved to, or even in a manner of speaking from, that environment and its conditions, that you can't really talk about it without talking about the environment. Or another way of thinking about it is in drawing, in art. There is a concept of positive and negative space, and there are exercises in which you look at a subject. For example, I could pick Mike on the floor and I would maybe draw a contour drawing, which means a continuous line drawing of the outside of his body. Right? And everything inside of that we would call Mike would be the subject, the positive space. However, I've also drawn all of the space around Mike, the negative space. And I could just as easily focus on the negative space where the space around Mike is meeting the outer outline of Mike and say that is actually what I'm drawing. And so this idea in Taoism and Tai Chi that what seem to be opposites actually arise together and sort of require each other, mutually support each other and define each other, and in that sense are not separate, is one of the fundamental concepts. So let's kind of take a look at the lines and what it's saying. I think that's the essence of it, but I think reading it line by line will help to reinforce that meaning. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Right, so this is saying the moment that we put on that interpretive framework of value judgment upon something, and we say that's beautiful, we immediately create ugliness in the world. Now, in other words, both beauty and ugliness are, as the saying goes, in the eye of the beholder. Meaning that those things are not reality as such, but our own interpretive frameworks upon the world. And especially if you look at other cultures and you look at cultures throughout time, you will see that the so-called standards of beauty have changed dramatically. This is why, for example, cave sculptures and more ancient art, oftentimes a beautiful woman was a more full-figured one, a heavier one, right? Because this meant that you were vital, that you were healthy, you were eating food, and you were capable of producing children, etc. Like the Venus of Willendorf, the little headless sculpture, seemingly headless sculpture of a woman, which is basically just like shoulders, giant breasts, giant abdomen, and hips. Very famous little totem. That is, prehistorical. And then, fast forwards, let's say, into the 1980s, everybody's walking around stick thin, right? Completely different standard of beauty. So it's not like there is universal beauty per se, at least not in that way. So it's interesting to recognize, and of course, if you're interested in anthropology, you'll come across this concept of ethnocentricity or ethnocentrism. And this is the idea that within, or cultural centricity, within your culture and within your ethnic group, you have a certain set of values and standards and ideas that seem universally right to you. But then if you go to another culture, you'll discover that the things that you assumed were universal human moral values are not. For example, in the West, we have our marriage traditions, especially modern ones, are extraordinarily free. Right? We marry the person that we individually choose for love, and that's like, in our minds, that is right. And let's say in India, they have arranged marriages. And actually, in their culture, that is right. And statistically speaking, roughly equal rates of success and happiness, reportedly, right? So that kind of might give you a knee-jerk reaction, perhaps. And there's many examples of things like that we typically accept as universal and true, as this is good and this is not good, or this is beautiful and this is ugly. And yet, we would be wrong on many counts. And so understanding that we do that in the first place, that we bring these interpretive frameworks of value onto things and we create opposition, we create separation that at the base of things doesn't really exist, is an important step in grasping that these things don't have to be in opposition to each other. That there's a means of harmonious coexistence between things that seem to be in opposition to each other. Okay. The next line says, being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. So this is kind of saying what I just said. The first line sets up the fact that once you create a value judgment or you define something as being separate from other things, you give birth to its opposite. And then in the next verse it says, these things come together. You can't have one without the other. So there's two ways of looking at that. You can look at it as, once you sort of name something and give it a value, you give birth to an opposite of it, and that's just that you have to recognize that if you want, for example, something that you deem as good, then other things that you deem as bad will emerge. It's impossible to have one without the other. And often, I think particularly in our modern culture, we have this tendency to think that the goal is to have everything be good as often as possible. And if everything could always be good, then that would be the ideal state of being. Yet, if you had, for example, a range of good, let's just say you had 10 levels of goodness. The bottom level of goodness is something that is just not bothersome, right? It's just kind of like isn't creating any trouble for me at all. Any negative emotions or any strife or anything like that. It's just, what you would say, it's okay. Did you like the meatloaf? It was okay, right? Not bad. I feel satiated. I wouldn't order it again. And then level 2 is, something that's actually pleasant, mildly pleasant. And level 3 is something that's more than mildly pleasant. There's a bit of enjoyment in it. And, 4 is greater enjoyment. And all the way up to 10, which is like you just had a religious experience. You just had an out of body. It was so good, right? And so there's this spectrum. Now, if that's the only spectrum of experience, well, then you could easily say that, at the top of that spectrum, number 10, well, that's ultimate good. But at the bottom of that can suddenly become evil, because that becomes the alternative, if you will, to that awesome experience. And if somebody or something or some force or some act is bringing you closer towards things that are just kind of meh, that would start to feel like suffering. In other words, the spectrum, no matter what you do, you can't have one without the other. Even if in your mind you imagine that as good, what you imagine as good suddenly becomes bad, if that's the full range of experience, right? The truth is, I think of these things as on an infinite spectrum. We don't know just how good things could become or just how bad things could become. And if it's infinite, well, then wherever you are, I guess it's just okay. Okay. And just okay meaning that's good. Now that is something I think a lot of us would debate, and then there are certainly feelings that we can have of being in a position where we would evaluate things as either being good or bad. But the point is that all of these experiences come together as a package deal. The moment you even initiate valuing, you have good and bad in a whole spectrum. And so if you want good experiences, you have to accept that there will be bad. If you want sunshine, you have to accept that there will be rain. If you want light, you have to accept that there will be dark. Right? If you want life, you have to accept that there will be death. That these things come together. That is the nature of manifest reality. Okay, last verse. There's only 3 verses. Therefore, the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has but doesn't possess, acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. So the master acts without doing anything. It doesn't mean that the master doesn't do anything, because she acts. But what does that mean? We talked this morning in our Tai Chi practice. Don't make any adjustments. Just stand, breathe, and attend. Now, if you were doing that, if you were really doing that, are you doing anything? When you're sleeping, are you doing anything? Right? When your heart is beating, are you doing that? This is what it means. So when we say doing, it's this notion of a purposeful action that you have to generate and maintain. That you are, in essence, in the driver's seat, behind the wheel with your foot on the gas pedal. You are controlling what happens, and in that manner you are manufacturing what happens. And if you've lived long enough, you've discovered that when you control what happens, usually you're going to make some mistakes, right? You're going to miss something. But there is a kind of natural unfolding of things that we're a part of, that everything is a part of. And when we do less and listen more, we become more and more aware of that. And if we sort of get in tune with that, this sort of, if you will, flow of things, although it doesn't always seem flowing, then we can sort of align ourselves to it. It's like kind of floating down river on a raft. River does most of the work. Every once in a while you put your stick in the water and avoid a log or a rock or something like that. But it's when we're trying to control everything that we tend to get stuck. So in this way, the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Doesn't mean she doesn't say anything. She's not trying to cram a lesson and instruct people and force them to do something, but rather her words are guiding them to their own revelation. So she acts as the river acts, as a force to take you somewhere, but it's up to you to learn. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. This is a tough one. And this is actually what the unfettered mind is about, Mike, largely. Things arise and she lets them come. Plenty of things arise in our lives, even within ourselves. And we immediately want to reject them because it is not the way we would like things to be. But if you think about, again, life and experience as this sort of ongoing river, and something comes flowing along the river that you don't want, you try to stop it, you try to hold it back, you're actually holding it in place. You're holding on to it in the sense that the experience can't pass. You continue to have to deal with it as long as you reject it. But the moment you can let it go, whatever needs to happen will happen. Maybe it won't be pleasant, but it will flow along the river. And eventually it will not be in your company anymore. On the other side, sometimes we want things really bad, and the river's tugging it away, and we cling and we cling and we cling and we cling, and it ends up dragging us into trouble. Sometimes we have to let things go. Actually, we kind of always do. In other words, we can't control what's going on. Most anything we can't control except for our internal state of how we're dealing with that which is happening. It doesn't mean we have no influence, and it doesn't mean that we don't participate in that unfolding and that we ourselves are not a factor in it. But the moment that we try to make things the way we want them to be, or make things not be the way we don't want them to be, we run into trouble, at least according to Taoism and according to Taoist philosophy, and certainly in my experience. It's not always easy, and sometimes we lose that balance within ourselves, because part of being is this duality, and sometimes we can get caught up in one side or the other. Also, when we name something, when we value something, this makes us want to pursue and cling or reject and flee from certain things. But part of the lesson of Taoism and the lesson of the practice of Tai Chi is to not do that, right? It's okay to have preferences and things that you don't prefer, but in the end to recognize you don't have control, and the focus is really to maintain your balance, your proper inner state in the midst of whatever's going on. It continues, she has but doesn't possess, right? Because things come and she has it, but she doesn't possess it. She doesn't try to hold it or keep it. She lets it go. It's a tough one, especially for parents. She acts but doesn't expect. One of the things we try to let go of the most in our Tai Chi practice is expectation. If you do partner work and you're doing push hands, when you do something, produce some force, receive some force, whatever you're doing, trying to change force, if you have an expectation for the result, what's going to happen, what you want to have happen, what you don't want to have happen, first of all, you're splitting your mind away from the present. You're not really listening. You're not really paying attention. You're just taking a cursory glance on what you think is going on and then trying to make what you want to have go on, go on. And so you have this forecast expectation. And we all do this. it's part of our survival mechanism, really. We're good at it. We have a notion of time. And because we're able to recognize that we pass through time and we understand that there is something called a future and something called a past, we forecast into the future and we make sort of these mental simulations, and then we try to figure out, well, what can we do to bring about this result and to avoid that result? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are typically way too many variables to do that with a high degree of accuracy, especially when things are happening very fast and dynamically. And in general in life, most of the time when we do that, things will often happen in a way that we did not expect, could not have expected, because there's just too many things that can emerge from sort of the space of the unknown. We can never hold all of the various things that can happen within our mind. And so in Tai Chi, in Taoism, I think the admonition is don't expect. Just move along and do your work. Be in the present and do what in the present is and seems to be the most right thing, and take it step by step. Finally, it says, when her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. This is kind of a big one in my opinion. When her work is done, she forgets it. Well, of course she does, because she is not doing it for any expected purpose. It's not like whatever she does had this sort of grand plan and desired result. It's just that she acts in accordance with her own nature and with the nature of what's going on. And once it's done, it's behind her. It doesn't matter. There's this, like the Zen story of Buddhist monks who come along a river, and there's a woman and she's having a struggle getting across, and they're not supposed to touch women, right? And so the master sees the woman struggling and he picks her up and throws her over her shoulder and carries her across the river. His disciple is aghast at this, doesn't say anything. On the other side of the river, the master puts her down and they walk on, and finally, seething, the disciple finally just bursts out with, how could you do that? How did you touch a woman? You know that's against our principles. And the master just looks at him and goes, oh, I put her down at the river. Why are you still carrying her? And so I think it's kind of like that. So this is chapter 2. And you can, I think, see how it unfolds from chapter 1. And this is the talk about opposites, right? The talk about how we create them, their effect on us, and the power of recognizing that they actually aren't in opposition and that we have to sort of let those go. I'll finish with this. Years ago, I had this sort of revelation, and I referred to it as the problem with creating the image, or simply the image. And there's a blog about it on my website. I think it's called Meditation versus the Image, or Meditation and the Image. But here's the point. When we sort of cling to a certain notion of reality, something that we do or don't want, or just a whole sort of framework and model of the way we see things, it's tantamount to sitting by a window where there's a scene and we take a photo of that scene, and then we hold the photo up in front of our view so that we see the photo in place of the scene. But outside, things have changed. The leaves have fallen off the tree, the cat that was there has left, the grass that was there has grown longer, the flowers have wilted maybe, it's raining where it was sunshine, but you don't see that because you're sort of stuck with your idea of the way things are. And you don't see that you're out of step with what's really going on. And so the idea then became, at first I thought, well, that means try not to create any images and just keep your awareness fixed on what's happening. But it's actually kind of impossible because it's how our brain works. We create images. That's what ideas are. That's what concepts are. And they're useful. They can be very useful. However, we can't help but create them. And I think the act of trying not to is a fool's errand. It's part of the way that our consciousness functions. But what we can do is we take the picture, glance at it, let it go, take another one, let it go, take another one, let it go, so that these ideas and images are sort of constantly updating, like an animation reel, which is really just a whole lot of pictures. And the reason it seems to be moving and changing is because you have one after the other, after the other, after the other, and you have to let one pass. If it doesn't and it gets stuck, then you just have a frozen picture. So in this sense, a lot of the times to really understand what's happening and to be in alignment with it and to act in alignment with it, we have to let go of the models that we've put on things and allow new ones to be created. But it's a kind of constant thing. So it's not like we completely crash and destroy our view of the world and then try to build a new one from scratch. It's more like our models are not fixed and rigid, they're flexible. In the same way that when we practice Tai Chi, we have alignment, right? We do have structure, but that structure is constantly moving and changing in accordance with whatever forces are at work, whether it's our movement intention or in partner practice, an external force, doesn't matter. Something happening in the world that causes us to have to change. But in the heart of that change is something that remains, right? There is a centeredness, a balance, an alignment, a being that is always there. So it's actually in the release of those rigid forms, those rigid ideas, that we actually discover what is always true. Hence, when her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. And I'll leave you with that.